I'm recasting this piece because there were problems with the soundtrack on the original. As with all the work that I do, you'll find copies of it on our iTutor website. Under the resources, you can see today's topics, the top of the list. That's because it's one of the oldest pieces of work I did. And in here, you'll find copies of the original presentation there. That's the Prezi that I used to make the screencast. An embedded copy of the YouTube clip. And I'm just going to slide down here so you can see this. Also, a downloadable PDF file of the notes that are in here. So all the text and imagery that's in here are in this, in a single piece of work. So go ahead and make what use of that you can. It's produced under a Creative Commons license so that it's freely redistributable. Nobody will be complaining about your use of it. The only thing that we do ask is that you give credit if you do use it. That's just ordinary academic practice. So crime, deviance and social control. It's one of those topic areas that's riveting. It's one of the things that people get into sociology to discuss. So what's a crime then? What do we mean by crime? Well, when you use the word crime, very often people conjure up images like this one here. Clearly, this is criminal. Yeah? This knife is being used in a threatening way. Identities are being concealed. Presumably there's some kind of extortion or mugging going on. It's illegal to carry a blade of that length in our society at all, and it's certainly illegal to carry a blade exposed of any length in our society. So there are a number of things about it that would say straight away crime, and they're all to do with breaking the law, which tends to leave us with the position of, oh, crime, well, that's anything that breaks the law. And that's okay, but it's not as good as it could be. In fact, if you ask lawyers about it, they would say, well, the problem is here, the law, as though law was all one thing. Now, they will tell you that the law can be broken down into lots of different stuff, so they talk about all sorts of different kinds of law. But for our purposes, we're just going to think about one kind of distinction that we find in law, and that's to say that there are these two basic types, civil and criminal. So the civil law is the thing that governs the relationship between private individuals or groups, say like a business. If I fell out with my neighbour about whose responsibility it was to look after the fence that separates our gardens, that's a civil matter. You know, assuming that we can't settle it between ourselves, we've fallen out big time, it's got to go to court to settle it. Then a civil court will make a decision and they will decide who was at fault in the dispute, and they will probably impose some kind of financial sanction to get the dispute settled. And that's how civil courts work, that's what they do. The alternative sort, this is criminal law. And criminal law governs the relationship between the individual or small groups, private things like individuals and groups, and society as a whole, or what we call in sociology the state. That's the political dimension of our society. So a criminal matter is when the state, through the Crown Prosecution Service and the police, brings a complaint to the criminal courts. And the reason we have criminal law as a separate thing is because if we lived in a society where coercive power, the ability to use physical violence, was available to everybody without restriction, we would live in a really quite unpleasant world. In fact, I'm just going to take you through, we're quoting this here, really. He's not the only guy to have said this. Is Tommy Hobbes. He was a philosopher in England in the 1600s, and he lived at the time or just after the Civil War and knew what kind of unpleasantness that was and how dangerous things were. So he complained about something that he called the state of nature. And the state of nature for him, state of nature isn't a term that he used exclusively. Lots of other philosophers talk about a state of nature. But for him, the state of nature would be one in which all individuals would fight all individuals. He talks about it as being the war of each against all. And the casualty of that isn't just the individuals who suffer, it's also our capacity to make culture. So he would say, under this state of nature, the war of each against all, there's no art, no letters, no society. But the thing that's much, much worse than that is that you get no peace. There's no predictability, no chance that today will be much the same as yesterday and tomorrow will be much the same as today. In other words, he says, and this is his byline, this is the thing that tells everybody you know your Hobbes if you use this phrase, he says, our lives would become nasty, brutish and short. And you might sometimes see that written down as ugly, brutish and short, but nasty is the phrase he actually used. So that's what Hobbes is telling us. And that's the reason why we have civil law. If we didn't have civil law, life would be nasty, brutish and short. And it's because the state has to be the thing that is the only agent in our society with the monopoly and I don't mean the board game here, I mean like in the business studies sense, the only supplier in the marketplace, a monopoly on the legitimate, and that means legal, use of violence. In order for us to live in a civilized society, we have to acknowledge that only one thing can use violence legitimately, and that's the agent of the state through things like the police or the emergency services. We'll look at that in a little more detail later. So that's why we have criminal law, and why any act that breaks the law is a bit simplistic. A crime is basically something that seeks to usurp the power of the state to use physical violence. So whilst we're thinking about these questions, what do we mean by deviance? I like this image for deviance because not only is it very shocking, but also there's this thing, a way to make daddy mad. Now, deviance in sociology is any act that doesn't fit in with the normal way of behaving. And that normal way of behaving is something that we got from our families. You might remember that about primary socialisation. That's where the family teaches us what is right and proper and how to behave. So making daddy mad, stepping outside of the norms of behaviour, it's a consistent idea. But it does also need a bit of thinking about. Just like we had to think about crime, not all forms of deviation, it's not just one thing. So they're not all equally undesirable. And some attract greater critical responses than others. So throughout the second half of the 20th century, there was a kind of norm in our societies whereby we would say, men go to work and women stay at home and look after the kids in the home. That's gender role segregation in the nuclear family. It's like the cereal packet family thing. So being a house husband was deviant because not only was it not what most people did, but it was also thought to be somehow not valued. It's not the proper thing for a man to do. But being a house husband wasn't as deviant as, say, having more than one husband or wife. Polygamy. Polygamy in our Western societies would have been seen as more deviant than stepping outside of the gender role. Also, it's sometimes tempting to think about deviance as being not as bad as crimes, but there's a problem with that, and it's that simplification thing again. It's sometimes possible to see crime as normal. In particular locales, crime is very normal, everybody's at it, but also for a society as a whole. For example, it's illegal to drive faster than 70 miles an hour in our country. And yet, nearly everybody who drives does that at one time or another. If you're driving down the motorway doing less than 69 miles an hour, even if you're in the slow lane, people will be flashing their lights and sounding their horns and making rude gestures at you because you're going too slow. They want you to adopt the norm of that group, which is to actually go slightly faster. So there's crime and deviance, they're key concepts. Now what about the processes in this? Control. Well, when we're talking about controlling deviation, it becomes about reinsuring or reinforcing conformity. And when we're talking about preventing or acting on criminality, it's social control. And so here the formal agencies of conformity and social control, these are the ones that are governed by the law. The most obvious is the police, but also the other emergency services too. Let's not forget that if the ambulance needs to get to a place to save a life, they are entitled to apply physical violence to your property to move it out of the way. And the same with the fire service. If they smash down your door, you can't later on go to them and say you broke up my property. Of course they did. They were saving your life or preventing the fire from spreading or something like that. So these are the only legitimate legal agents of social control in our society. Our society can call upon the military to support this process, but normally the military is not an agent of social control. It's between societies rather than within societies. And in fact, for a legal action on the part of the military, the state has to call for the support of the military through a declaration of martial law. If the military decide to step in and take control, we normally refer to that as a coup d'etat, as a French phrase, a cut at the state, where the military are chopping the state rather than waiting for it to tell it what to do. So ultimately, the police represent the ability of the state, the political part of our society, to make individuals behave in certain ways. In sociology, we call this repression, and some sociologists would say all repression is bad. I don't know whether I agree with that. But any part of the state that represses the individual can be described as part of the repressive state apparatus. That's a phrase from Louis Althusser. He's a French sociologist. He uses the idea to talk about the rights of the state and the rights of the individual. So here's another agent of social control: customs, excise, tax and revenue, financial regulation. So these mechanisms influence our behaviour by making some behaviours way too expensive. If you want to stop people from smoking and drinking, put the duty up on the cigarettes and the alcohol. So the other thing that we can do, of course, is to make certain behaviours more desirable by making them financially valuable. So we have in the past manipulated or sought to manipulate family life by imposing or creating tax breaks for people who live through marriage. I don't know whether that's a particularly valuable mechanism or not, but it's certainly a possibility that you have to be aware of. Now, those two mechanisms, those two groups, directly influence us for social control. These, the judiciary, the courts, and the prison and probation service, are slightly more indirect because they're still part of the repressive state apparatus, but they don't have power over ordinary citizens directly. So before we can be influenced by the courts or by the prison system, we've got to be arrested and charged by the police and also be shown to be guilty of the charge. So these formal agencies of social control, they only influence us when we're accused and convicted of a crime. So they don't really have a direct influence on deviance. But the police, for example, can. If the local chief of police decides that he wants to see less deviant forms of behaviour, like loitering on the street corner, he can direct his police force to prioritise that as a target. You can't do that through the courts. So those are the formal agencies of social control and conformity. We've got informal ones. The first one we've already spoken about, and that's the family. Now, the family give us, through primary socialisation, our sense of what is right and what is proper. So the important things, the values, and the right way to behave because of them. I'm not going to go bang on about that. You'll know that about from your sociology of the family. So the family is our first organisation, our first informal institution of social control. Then we have the peer group. Now, you get to choose your friends to some extent. Not completely, obviously. If you live in the wrong social class, you don't get to choose those people to be your friends. And so this time, what we have is secondary socialisation. So some norms and some values get reinforced and others get played down or put to one side, displaced. And so we choose those people who we want to spend time with, and we look to this group to tell us the norm, the right way to behave, and to tell us what things are important and valuable. Now, these are the other kinds of informal institutions. They're formal in the sense that they are provided for out of law, but their function isn't primarily about social control. So, and we could add to them education, employment. We could also add the health service, the benefits agency. There's a bunch of these things. So, when we're not able to make choices about these social institutions that we have to interact with, so we're more likely to resent them. And most of us have to go to school or work, but we're likely to think that any direct attempts by the school or the employer to control us and regulate our behaviour, we find that unpleasant and we're likely to become resistant, which means that these institutions tend to adopt a more subtle approach. So you might remember this from your sociology of education, this thing about the hidden curriculum. So here's a curriculum of norms and values, if you like, some secondary socialisation, being hidden behind a gender-segregated dress code, pink for the girls, blue for the boys. Now, it's not saying that boys are better than girls or girls are better than boys. What it's doing is it's pointing out this distinction is important. And that allows us later on to say which is better or which is worse, or it reinforces that. So we get these kind of subtle mechanisms that don't necessarily promote a particular value, but draw our attention to distinctions of class, gender, ethnicity, race, all sorts of other things like that. In school, we talk about the hidden curriculum, this collection of norms, values and roles and statuses that we learn to start to live by are not part of any totally planned learning. And that is the whole of it. Like I said, you can find copies of it on the website. Please feel free to go and help yourself, and thank you very much for listening.